Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. This is Jewish history like you've never heard it before. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Efraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Guttentag. It was an Agudas Yisrael session sometime in the 1920s. The famous Dr. Nathan Birnbaum, whose tshuva journey from Zionist founder and secular ideologue back to Torah and recently shaken the Jewish world, finished speaking about saving the Jewish people. But not everyone agreed with his approach. A distinguished Rav from Eastern Europe had a podium and was railing against the machinations of secular Jews who were destroying the Jewish people. V'chamushim alu, only a fifth of the Jewish people left Egypt, he thundered, meaning that the majority were beyond redemption. When he finished, Nathan Birnbaum, imposing with his long, whitening beard, asked again for the floor. There in the Agudas Yisrael meeting, he shocked the assembled with his words. "Have you ever eaten on Yom Kippur?" he asked the Rav who just spoken. White-faced, the target of his question didn't know how to respond. "Have you ever eaten on Yom Kippur? Because I have, and here I am." The point echoed in the room. Secular Jews weren't beyond the pale, because if Nathan Birnbaum could find his way home, so could anyone. That story, Rabbi Efraim Galinsky, was told to me by no other than Rabbi Moshe Grylak, Zichron Livracha, whose father was very close to Nathan Birnbaum. Did you ever hear him say that one?
I never heard that story, but he probably heard a lot of things from his father, who lived through those years in Agudas Yisrael. I think his father was an Aguda activist. He was a chassid of the Imre Emes, who was one of the founders of Agudas Yisrael.
I didn't know that. It was a Gerach chassid.
Yeah.
And Rabbi Grylak's father. So Rabbi Grylak, when he said this, I'm not sure it's said at the same time or separately to me. I had a number of conversations with him. Said we had a piercing definition of Nathan Birnbaum and his role, and I think that really goes with that story, whether he said them together or not. He said Nathan Birnbaum was the Avraham Avinu of the modern era. He's the man who smashed every secular idol of the modern Jewish time. The man who founded Zionism, broke with it, moved to Yiddishism, as we saw in the last episode, and broke with it. Finally arrived to play a part on the stage of the great Orthodox revival that was Agudas Yisrael, which is exactly where this interaction.
Going back to what you mentioned in the last episode, that some writer pointed out that Nathan Birnbaum was erratic, right? And I think that the biggest proof against his claim against Nathan Birnbaum is the fact that once he found Yiddishkeit, he never left it. Stayed strong in his Yiddishkeit. He was always powerful in pointing, areas that we need to be improving in our Yiddishkeit and in our outreach. But the fact was that he remained steadfast in his emunah and shmiras hamitzvos until the end.
And so let's give those a time frame, because recalling what we said in the previous episode was that he was born in 1864. His tshuva, which we're about to unpack, happened around the time of the First World War, so it's 50 years into his...
It's before the First World War, because Rav Tuvi Horowitz, that we're going to talk about later, he met him already as a known Baal Teshuva during the First World War. So it happened before.
So it's basically around his, around 50 years old just before. And then his involvement afterwards was with Aguda. And we're going to see. So let's just not jump the gun, just give people an idea where we're heading in this particular episode. And this particular episode is, I think we're just calling it the Baal Teshuva, because that's a direct quote from someone's assessment at the time. He was the paramount Baal Teshuva, the one who was the precursor, the forerunner of the modern Baal Teshuva movement. And in this episode, I want to unpack how his Teshuva unfolded, and secondly, the impact of his change, because this was a massively influential person. And we'll just get a sense of that by the number of kind of that jaw-dropping all over Eastern, Western Europe and beyond as well. And thirdly, his legacy in the frum world and what he went on to do. And I think those are important things because there is a legacy, and let's just define that for ourselves.
If you would allow me, just one sentence of introduction is that, we tend to measure someone's success and his impact, and how many Baalei Teshuva came in his wake, right? How many Baalei Teshuva did Uri Zohar create afterwards? And so regarding Nathan Birnbaum, I don't know if we have any up-to-date...
Well, there was non-Kirov spreadsheet movement.
right. No Pew reports either, right?
No, correct.
So, however, one thing is very clear is that until he arrived on the scene in Agudas Yisrael, so the spokesmen's, or whatever in the plural, of Agudas Yisrael were all, East European, and or you had Rabbi Yaakov Rosenheim from the Western Europe. But the fact that you had someone there who was really educated and as a doctorate, as you said, and a famous statesman beforehand, and he moved sides. So besides the Baalei Teshuva that he created, right, and we don't know how many.
He legitimized it.
Exactly. That's what he did. He gave like the strength to withstand. And you have to understand at that time, I hope we're not diverging, but you have to understand that the Zionist movement at that time reached a decision, and this is all clear in Herzl's writings and in the protocols of the Zionist movement, that they decided besides for their attempts and efforts to settle Eretz Yisrael, they went on another mission called Kibush HaKehilot. You ever hear that term before?
Conquering the organized killer structure.
They realized that in order for them to really be the representative of Judaism in the world, to claim the land, right, they would need two things. They need like the funding, right, and the public support of East European Jewry, which was mainly Frum, right? And they had this systematic approach to take over the funds and the organizational activities of East European Jewry.
In other words, to become the indisputed representatives of the Jewish people.
Exactly. That they did by taking over the kehilos in East Europe.
It reminds me of, I think there's an organization in America, the Conference of Presidents. So the Conference of Presidents was set up after the Second World War, when the American government, I forget which leader, posed the question. He was getting bombarded from all sorts of Jewish groups, from all sorts of directions. He said, who speaks for the Jews? And he said, decide amongst yourselves and then come to organize with one voice. In other words, that was the question then. They knew if they could speak for the Jews. In order to speak for the Jews, it wasn't just enough to take over what went over in Palestine as it was then. They also, as you say, had to kibush hakilot, to conquer and to take over a coup.
And you have people who have this tendency to be more modern, even though they're still frum, right? And you have a spokesman who's like representing the Golos Yid, right? And opposite them, you have the modern Zionist thinkers and speakers. It's like a lost battle with the Jews in between, those who are like leaning towards modernity.
The Yeshivos is all over there. The leadership is
right.
all over there.
And Nathan Birnbaum,
he was too big to ignore.
Exactly.
He was too central a player to say, well, sit at the back of the, just sit at the back. Or...
No, for the Jews themselves, they
Right.
felt that there's someone here articulate, educated, right, who's backing the Agudas Yisrael's policies.
Correct. And that was because of his tshuva journey, which let's talk about that now. I think it's fair to say, look, the Kirov organization, the Baal Teshuva movement today is a fact of Jewish life, has been so long established that in fact the Frum community wouldn't even know. They have the Yeshivas and you have the Beis Yaakovs and you have the Kirov movement. It's just kind of another arm of the Frum establishment. And we've talked actually a couple of episodes ago about the rise of the Teshuva movement, etc. But Nathan Birnbaum existed long before any of this. His Teshuva, and important to say, his Teshuva was so sincere and shocking to his contemporaries that they called him the Baal Teshuva. The Baal Teshuva. It was just unprecedented. What was unprecedented was that he went from the enlightened West to the benighted backward East. He went against the flow. No one was doing that. That was almost unheard of. His Teshuva was a process, not an overnight decision. And
you mentioned that someone who called him the Avraham Avinu of the...
That was Rabbi Grylak, called the Avraham Avinu, because he smashed all the Psalim.
I think it's more than that.
Go
because on. It's the Chazal say about Avraham Avinu that Shtei Kilyosav Limdu Oisei Torah, right?
I thought you were going to say the other thing.
It came from inside. There was no one who was Mekarev him.
I mean, you're going to talk in a little bit about the people who taught him, but as you said...
That's a different stage in his tshuva.
So how did this happen? It's actually very interesting. He himself wrote, there's bits and pieces, we can piece it together, part of it. The first very interesting memory of my great-grandfather, his oldest son, was Professor Shlomo Osher Birnbaum, Zalman Birnbaum, and who became Baal Teshuva with his father. He said when he was older, he looked back and he remembered the scene from when Nathan Birnbaum was a relatively young man. He said that Nathan Birnbaum, they were living in Vienna on some third-floor apartment, and they looked down, and there's a peasant coming along with his cart, and in the cart had his whole family and all his worldly goods piled high. And trundling down the street, and they probably hit a pothole, and the whole thing upended, fell on the floor. You know, this man's life was there rolling back in the gutter of Vienna. And Nathan Birnbaum muses to himself. He said something along the lines of, if there is a God, if you exist, how could you allow this to happen? Now, this was years before he became Baalei Teshuva. But my great-grandfather remembered his father, Nathan Birnbaum, saying this, and he writes, again, my great-grandfather writes, that this was a very odd statement for somebody who was a self-professed atheist. So there was clearly, I think it's clear to say, there was a process. God, if you exist, well, if you don't exist, what's this conversation with this kind of, you know, this God who may or may not exist? So clearly there was a process going on. But I think that Nathan Birnbaum alludes to this, and he writes this in one or two places. There was the realization of God's existence came to him in stages. We mentioned in the last episode his encounter. He was on the ship going 1908 to America, still not from Yiddishist phase. We talked about that as his second phase.
So his encounter with the forces of nature, of the sea, that moved something in him.
And he wrote, the first sensation of the master of the universe was awoken in me as I was traveling across the ocean, he wrote. And obviously we've referenced and re-referenced, even recently, the words of the Chazon Ish in talking about this, you know, if a person, in fact, 2 episodes ago, which was when we talked about the, you know, a person, tshuva, the process of tshuva, and whether it happens through tragedy and things like this. And you said, and you remarked that based on the Chazon Ish, the key ingredient is this openness, this reflectiveness that can come about when someone has the time and the, you know, is free of the distraction enough to contemplate the world and to let it talk to him. And in fact, I have in my notes here somewhere, probably struggle to find it. He says very clearly that in one of his post-tshuva works, his Am Hashem, where he talks about, it came originally written in German as Gottesvolk, right? And he writes there that I never looked for God, and therefore I didn't need to find him. It occurred to me suddenly. And that's all he says there. But he's referring to this moment where he had this sense of Kirvas Elokim, and he said in 1908, it came, and then it left. It left. Because we have to understand, Nathan Birnbaum was battling this incredible weight of materialism. He had assumed this, he had underwent this transition as a teenager from someone who's open to belief in God, as he himself writes, to a bit materialistic viewpoint of the world in which he didn't believe, in which he said later he was a total atheist. He was battling with that. The materialism didn't leave him all at once. 1908 came and went, and then it was left to a few years later.
His second revelation,
Yep.
he said, was during a lecture at the Congress.
Yes, I believe that was, the one who recorded that was the man who went on to become Israel's president.
Second president, I think.
Yes. And he writes that he saw this himself. I went to see the famous Zionist Dr. Birnbaum talk. It was after 1910 or something around there in St. Petersburg. Okay, so you can imagine he's a famous lecturer, these peregrinations up and down Europe or to speak and to lecture and to motivate. And he was speaking about something else. I think Zionism, at least that was presumably the topic. So he clearly was still playing around with these ideas. And after he said a remarkable thing, after he finished, Dr. Birnbaum sat down and then gets up and said something to the effect of, "Can I speak again?" And he claps out on the table and he says, "I've realized that God exists and the Torah is true and that we have to follow it." And that was the moment, Yitzchak Ben Tzvi says this was the moment that he recognized that life had to change. Suddenly. And he never looked back. As you say, he never looked back. This was not an erratic person. I'm sorry to belabor the point.
That works well with the timeline. You're saying that happened in 1910. And by 1917, he was already a full-fledged Baalei Teshuva, not East European Yid, but a full Baalei Teshuva. So it happened probably right before World War I.
Yeah, and it seems to have been a process in which this thing years before, in which he's looking down at the peasant cart, saying to God, if you exist, you know, and then you have this thing in which they've felt the closeness of God, and then you have this encounter in St. Petersburg. So then there's obviously a process. But the sea thing, by the way, it's Rabbi Grylak who said, we know that the sea played a part in this because I think we said in the first episode that he would say to his descendants, please read Mafta Yonah, because Yonah's experience, revelation happened at sea. But Rabbi Grylak, again, this is Rabbi Grylak's Le'ilui Nishmas, to hear the great Rebbe of Birnbaum be quoted, he said an interesting thing, that when the Nazis rose in 1933, Nathan Birnbaum moved to the seaside town of Scheveningen in Holland, and as Rabbi Grylak's father was walked with him along the beach, okay, it's a seaside town, tears came to Nathan Birnbaum's eyes, and he began to speak about his tshuva. Right? In other words, the sea reminded him of it. And so that was, you have to understand, I think if we see a great fiery prophetic soul of anyone who reads any of his writings, quite difficult to get through. So that's where it happened.
By the way, Rabbi Grylak also had his sea moment. I don't know if you ever heard this from him.
No.
But he would tear up when he would say this. If you know Rabbi Grylak's history, he was a child of 5 years old, taking care of a younger child, 3 years old, when they crossed the border alone.
Sounds like Yerushalmi kids. Standard practice. The 5-year-old baby sits the 3-year-old.
But he was taking care of his 3-year-old sibling, and they crossed the border alone into Switzerland. And he describes, when they come to Eretz Yisrael, he describes the first sighting of Yaffo, whatever it was. Mm. And he says, like, the whole boat would just burst out crying. It was the...
Halavai, we had that same sensitivity.
Right.
It's the same age. Correct. We're just as lucky to be here. Rabbi Galinsky, let's hear a bit about who the influences were, because I just know some names. One of them was a young Rav Moshe Chaim Lau, the father of former Israeli Chief Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, and I've seen this, in the Birnbaum archives in Toronto, family archives, huge correspondence. You see there this rabbinical candidate. He wrote this, Rav Moshe Chaim Lau, who was a first cousin of Rameir Shapiro, took over for him as Rav Piotrkov. And he wrote as a candidate Rabbani, you can see in his headed notepaper, rabbinical candidate, whatever that meant, corresponding with Nathan Birnbaum. Well, there's many others as well, but there was one major influence.
Right, so I'm going to focus on one of them, but I want to point out one very important nakuda, and I think every person listening to this podcast will come up with the following question. And Nathan Birnbaum himself relates to this question. And that is, we see his life story. And he was saying, I have a perfect explanation. He was kicked out of the Zionist movement, right? And he found a new job in Agudas Yisrael. So maybe his whole tshuva process was just a means to
rebound from...
right? To find a new job, right? And Nathan Birnbaum himself mentioned this thought that people thought about.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And I want to tell you one thing. When you read how he evolved, like his tshuva process evolved, it's totally impossible, because he couldn't have dreamt how he would become at the end the Secretary General of Agudas Yisrael at that tkufa.
He wasn't in search of a Stella.
Yeah, not at all. No, it couldn't have happened, because in normal way it couldn't have happened. So he became a Baal Teshuva on his own, like we said before, right? The initial inspiration came by himself, and he started to write extensively. Yeah. About Yiddishkeit, about his plans for Amat Torah, like you said before. And he had demands from Orthodoxy that they're not doing enough. Mekarev, to be like light for other Yidden. But something happened during this period which changed the course of his life, okay? And I don't know if anyone could have planned this out. And Nathan Birnbaum himself said it was mamash hashgacha elyona that this happened. So what happens is there was a famous Rebbe in Europe. I don't know if people will know his name. His nickname is the Avas Yisrael, okay? The Avas Yisrael of Vishnitz. So today, if you have, I don't know how many Vishnitz Rebbes we have today throughout the world, but they all stem from the Avas Yisrael of Vishnitz. He's the father of the Imre Chaim, the father of Damesek Eliezer and Makor Baruch, and the grandfather of the Rebbe in Yerushalayim and Vishnitz Monsey and all the other Vishnitzes that you know.
Don't forget London.
In London, right? So all of them come from the Avas Yisrael. His court was established later on in, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Gosvedain, okay?
Excuse me if we have any of the, you can write in and correct us, a horrible mangling of the...
That's where his court was established at a certain tkufa. And he had a nephew by the name of Tuvia Horowitz.
So that makes him a cousin of the Imre Chaim.
Exactly.
Okay.
First cousin, right. So Tuvia Horowitz himself had an interesting life story. At a certain period, you just mentioned Rabbi Shapiro a few minutes ago. Rabbi Shapiro, he left the town of Sanuk to become the Rav of Lublin, I think. I think that was his last stage before he went to Lublin. And Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz took over his position. At a certain point, he was also one of the heads of Beis Yaakov, and he traveled to fundraise for them, and he did a lot of things. A hush of a person. Now, Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz was captivated by Nathan Birnbaum's writing at a time where the normal average from Jew...
The writings post-Tshuva.
Post-Tshuva, right? And he's very inspired by them. And at that time, no one knew about him. Inside, like the Frum Orthodoxy, no one knew about him.
Because he'd had his revolution at home. As you said, he'd cooked up his own revolution. He decided on his own.
Right.
Yeah.
But he was very inspired by the new life that he brought into Yiddishkeit.
Yeah.
Which is something that sometimes you have to have someone from
outside
sees
something differently.
Right. If I can say just one word that I heard from my Rebbe, Rabbi Hillel Zaks, so it says that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was trying to convince Yisro to stay with them in the Midbar, he says, right, so the Targum says, it was like the nisim that were done to us, you saw with your eyes. So Rabbi Hillel said, what is he saying over here? So he says that Klal Yisrael at that kufa in the Midbar was so accustomed to the nisim, they didn't realize the nisim. You understand? They had to have someone from the outside to open up our eyes to the nes, right? Rabbi Hillel gave us a whole description of the Onan and all that. In any case, so Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz was captivated by these new writings, okay? And again, no one knew about him in the Frum world. And if anything, they suspected him. So there are stories that Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz carries around a picture of Nathan Birnbaum in his bag, whatever it was, and someone discovers it in the Avos Yisrael's court in Vishnitz. And
in his tallis bag.
Whatever.
His Rebbe's tallis bag made of half a cow.
Yeah. And they go to snitch to the Avos Yisrael that he's...
got a maskil in his tallis bag.
That he's walking around with a picture of Herzl.
Oh, correct.
He looked like Herzl.
Well, he looked...
A long black beard.
I want to say...
know the difference.
He's a Birnbaum. My family of Birnbaums. He looked like a Birnbaum. But he was,
black beard.
No
right?
yarmulke,
no yarmulke.
Frock coat, like Vienna of the... late 19th century.
Right. So anyway, they snitched on him, and the Avos Yisrael knew who his nephew was, and he calmed things down. I mean, he was fine with that. And then comes a certain point, which is during World War I, where Tuvia Horowitz decides that he has to visit Nathan Birnbaum. Okay? This doesn't mean that Tuvia Horowitz was willing to believe or accept anything Nathan Birnbaum says. He had his suspicions, like any from East European Jew would have. And it's a fascinating story. He comes to Vienna and he describes the terrible matzav there of the Jewish refugees on the streets. It was First World War, and he said there were people who were rich Jews, and he saw them on the street just begging for money to eat. And it was a terrible matzav. And he says he's pushing his way through the crowds. He reaches this building, and he knew already that Dr. Nathan Birnbaum got a job through the Zionist movement to archive the situations of the Jews at that time. He was in charge of the archive of the Zionist movement. And he goes into this building, and he's looking around. And I remember I told you the story in the last episode that these German Jews are looking at him and say, you're looking for your friend, in quotation marks, and says, go down the hallway and you'll find his door. And he goes down the hallway and he sees the sign on the door, Dr. Nathan Birnbaum, and he knocks and he invites him in. And he was so in awe. At that time already, he had a long white beard and looked very impressive. And he was so in awe of Tuvia, he couldn't get a word out of his mouth. He just sat there in silence. And Nathan Birnbaum wanted to, why did you come? What did you come for? What do you want? And nothing worked. He couldn't talk. And then I don't know how he sensed that Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz comes from the Ropshitz dynasty. He was an Enoch of the Ropshitz dynasty, which is where Nathan Birnbaum came from, right? So he started to schmooze with him about Ropshitz, okay? And that's what opened him up. And that's how their kesher started between them. And they carried on a very long correspondence afterwards. And the correspondence is surprising because today, when a Baal Teshuva comes to you, so, we're accustomed, we welcome him in open arms and we just, mekarav him and all that. But Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz carries on a very lengthy correspondence with Dr. Nathan Birnbaum, and he's asking him one by one his views on the Yud Gimel Ikrim.
In other words, you can't just walk in the door and say I'm about Tshuva.
Exactly.
You got to pass the test. What do you believe?
Right. And he reaches the conclusion that not only were his answers appropriate to the answers of an Orthodox Jew, they were more inspiring than the standard Orthodox Jew. And that's when he decided, then he accepted Nathan Birnbaum as an authentic Baalei Teshuva. Rabbi Tuvi Horowitz, being a very influential member of Agudas Yisrael, he is the one who makes the connection.
With who?
It doesn't say. I didn't find that. But what I did find was that Nathan Birnbaum tells him this is pure hashgacha pratis, because Nathan Birnbaum himself wanted that shaykhus back to East European Jewry, and the doors were closed for him. And Tuvi Horowitz is the one who opened the doors for him. This is a ma'is hashgacha pratis, and to understand that this led to the Frum Orthodoxy in East Europe gaining a mouthpiece, which they couldn't have dreamt of.
I think, let's take that further, Galinsky, by just getting a sense of what is some of his, you mentioned his writings, and we've mentioned bits and pieces along, but his writings, after he becomes Baalei Teshuva, he doesn't stop. In fact, he just continues full steam ahead, and he adopts a passionate and sometimes bitter tone against the takeover of the Jewish people by a minority. And he actually goes through the maths. You know what he says? He says the observant Jews, those who want the Messiah, are 4 to 1 greater numbers than nobody. He goes through, he actually mentions the Sephardim as well, and he says 4 to 1. How dare this minority take over? And he says, look how they look down on us, the Frum Jews. He says like this, and this is something he wrote in a famous essay published in Zurich in 1919. This essay was called, in Yiddish, was called In Golus by the Eden, right? In the Jewish Golus. And it's a piercing critique of the takeover of the coup staged by the secular movement over the corpus of the Jewish people, which by definition is an Am HaTorah and Am Hashem.
As I explained before, the way they did it is that they took the goal of Eretz Yisrael and they used that to take over.
Yeah. And he says like this, on the day that the idea appeared in the minds of the Jews, that the light shines in foreign quarters and that in our camp there is darkness, that therefore we must bring in light to the darkness, on that day our exile started among our fellow Jews. That's what he writes in this essay. Very famous. By the way, we find this became such a standard phraseology in the Aguda world that after the war, the famous son-in-law of the Emir Emes, the great Gera political activist, Itzhamaya Levin, who was an Israeli government minister in the early years.
Only the first Knesset.
First, right.
Agudas Yisrael was part of the government only in the first Knesset.
But
until Menachem Begin, they were not part of them.
So Rabbi Itzhamaya Levin, very, very influential. And he says, he quotes I was just reading in one of the newspapers and one of the archives, in which he's talking about attacks on religious Jewry. And he quotes this thing. He just says, that's what Dr. Nathan Birnbaum meant by saying it was galut begalut etzel hayudim.
I never knew that he was the one who coined that term.
It was Nathan Birnbaum in Golus by Yidden. And that rings true today. There are those who would, if you took this phrase today, there are many who would agree that this is the terrible, what you see, the militant secularism being deployed against Torah ideas regularly in this country. There are many who would say, oh, that's what, yes, we've got our own country, but there's a Golos going on over here. Okay, so I wonder what Nathan Birnbaum would have to say on that. But he certainly felt that when you had the overwhelming secular takeover of the Jewish communities and the crushing of the traditional architecture. And there's another thing, I think, also, which is to get a crucial bit of context about his tshuva. I've often thought, we talk about the tshuva movement, the closest parallel you could find to the shock caused to the enlightened Jewish leadership, the Western European Jews of Nathan Birnbaum's tshuva, the only parallel you could find is probably the tshuva of Uri Zohar. Because Uri Zohar was in a time when the celebrities were celebrities, not intellectuals. But Nathan Birnbaum lived in a time when you can find old postcards online. People used to send a Rosh Hashanah postcard to each other with his picture. He was a Jewish celebrity, he was an intellectual and a Jewish leader. And that man slammed the door and said, as Rabbi Grylak said, he smashed those idols. That caused tremendous shock. I think the closest parallel is this cultural earthquake that Uri Zohar triggered in the 70s with his tshuva.
100%. But I think the next stage would be his entrance to Agudas Yisrael.
I think that one other, just to get an idea of who he was dealing with, how influential he was, and how others saw him, another story from Rabbi Grylak. And we know this because Rabbi Grylak, what he did, he, sometime in the 70s and 80s, he would take out adverts in the secular Israeli papers, Ma'ariv and Yediot, full-page adverts, in which he would write a column about different people, often about Nathan Birnbaum. The story that Rabbi Grylak told in one of those columns was of the Russian Zionist leader, very famous man, Menachem Usishkin, those who know Chav Usishkin in Yerushalayim. He was one person who encountered Nathan Birnbaum at different stages of his metamorphosis. In 1891, he came through Vienna, and he made his pilgrimage to the famous Zionist leader, Dr. Nathan Birnbaum. After they finished talking, Usishkin goes along and he says to Nathan Birnbaum, can you direct me to a kosher restaurant? So Birnbaum walked Usishkin there, and when Usishkin said, will you join me inside? He says, no, I won't eat in such a place. Meaning, Bashita don't eat kosher, right? I don't know.
He was like a fruma pikoris.
He was a fruma pikoris. Maybe he just didn't like it.
By the way, Uri Zohar himself coined himself, Haiti Chiloni dos, meaning I was a frum Chiloni.
Right, very machmir. Right, so he was, maybe he just didn't like the food. But anyway, that's the charitable explanation. Many years later, Menachem Usishkin comes through Vienna again now, and he meets Nathan Birnbaum, who's now Baalei Teshuva. And it reminds him of the last time they met and what had happened. In other words, what do you mean? The big, ripping figure. You wouldn't eat in a kosher restaurant before. Nathan Birnbaum says to him, you, Usishkin, have stayed the same. I've changed. I represent the dynamic type of Jew. Meaning that what I was yesterday doesn't necessarily dictate what I'm going to be tomorrow, and therefore is going to change. But that gives you some idea of just how he was perceived at the time. He was a leading figure whose betrayal, he became a renegade from the secular Zionist movement or the secularism in general, and that's how he was written out of history.
So our next stage will be that he is chosen for a job in Agudas Yisrael.
In 1919, he's chosen as the Agudas Yisrael's first Secretary General. Now, when I say first, it means because the organization was founded a few years earlier in Katowice, but then because of the First World War, nothing much happened. So in 1919, that's essentially when it gets off the ground. Nathan Birnbaum was then in touch with very great people across the board. One was the Ger Rebbe, was the Imre Emes, the Reisherov, who was Rav Aaron Levin, and then the Rav Karlebach of Altona, Rav Joseph Tzvi Karlebach, and also a leader of the Chov Vetzion movement. There you see loads of correspondence there in the archives there, who was Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever, who is a famous figure more famed in the Mizrahi world today, in Mizrahi history. And he's becoming an activist for a young Aguda. Aguda was young then.
And he travels to America,
right,
to convince the Americans to open up their Agudas Yisrael branches, which happens at the end.
Which is interesting because a few years ago, must have been 3 years ago, the Agudas Yisrael of America did celebrated their centennial, I think, and 100 years, century, and where does that number come from? 1922, to that journey, when a famous photo from that journey shows he goes with the Kli Chemda, who's Rameir Don Plotsky, and other big rabbonim, and he's there sitting next to them. I mean,
Meir Hildesheimer, I think.
Yes, and so they're en route to America. That's where this picture's taken on behalf of Agudas Yisrael, which, in other words, he had a part in founding Aguda in the New World. So this was not, I think you can see legacy there happening.
You mentioned the Kli Chemda.
Yeah.
I have to tell you a Maisa Ashgacha Pratis from yesterday.
Fresh off the press.
Okay, I'm learning in yeshiva. I'm learning a difficult sugya. And then I said, okay, I have to take a break for a few minutes. So I close the Gemara and I stand up and just to refresh my mind. So I see in front of me in a book from Art School on Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, written by Jonathan Rosenblum. And I open up the book, and what do I see in front of me? A picture of Nathan Birnbaum. Okay?
Yeah.
And he writes that Rav Shraga Feivel was a big fan of Rav Nathan Birnbaum's writings, and he would encourage his Talmidim, Torah V'das, to read his writings. Okay? And then I come across the most fascinating quote, okay?
Prepare to be fascinated.
This is Mamash Ashkacha Protest. Like the day before I'm supposed to participate in the podcast of Rabbi Nathan Birnbaum, this is what pops into my eyes. Rabbi Shraga Feivel quoted Rabbi Meir Don Plotsky, the great Polish Rav, who said that Nathan Birnbaum's Das Torah was comparable to that of anyone he knew.
Now, that is literally stunning.
Das Torah, not Das Balabatim.
To quote Jonathan Birnbaum a few years ago, do you know what he said to me? He said, Jonathan, about your Zayda, your great-grandfather, he was the Baalei Teshuva who refused to sit at the back of shul. In other words, he's a fresh Baalei Teshuva. Sit there. Who are you lecturing everyone for? What right do you have? And the answer was he was a tzaddik, and he was seen to be a tzaddik. But that's an incredible
That's
thing,
a quote.
isn't it?
That's an
That's a
unbelievable
quote.
quote.
He says, the
Shraga
Klichemda
Feivel
said,
quoting the Klichemda,
as saying,
that he has
Das
Das
Torah
Torah to anyone, comparable to anyone that he knew, lived in the generation of the Chavetz Chaim, of Chaim Oizer.
and now I think I'm just going to throw in this quote from just to provide what could that possibly mean? So in one of the old books I was showing you before, my precious stack of pamphlets and little booklets that were original prints of in different languages, Nosson Rimram's work. The introduction is by Moshe Schoenfeld, who was the
famous Agudis.
famous
Right.
Agudis, and he was, involved in
Famous
publishing.
author.
Correct. And he writes something that is so I think it's definitive about to understand Nosson Birnbaum, but also I think to understand, applicable when you think about it. He says like this: the concept of Goinus, you talk about Hayarav Hagoin, is normally, you'd normally think of it in the terms of lomdus and learning. He says, but it's not just applied to that, relegated to that, limited to that. It can also be to any person who achieves something outstanding in a different area of serving Hashem. And he says, Nosson Birnbaum was a goin in tshuva. Moshe Schoenfeld writes about. He was a goin in tshuva. And that's what great Gedalia and great people like this, like the Klichemda, would have seen. He was a person of such purity of heart. It's like you say about Yoshua HaMelech, as it says, a person who threw aside everything in the search for emes and lived a life of poverty because he was searching for emes. That continued right through his life. And that is why you're saying, I have to take issue, Efraim, with something you said at the end, that when he became Baalei Teshuva, he stayed on that course to the end of his life. It's true. He never went back. In fact, he only went forward. He only became more of a Baalei Teshuva. And yet, he could not take when Jews didn't live up to their own ideal. Right. His own honesty and his own bikasha emes, this drive for truth, was so searing that he couldn't take it. And so he told them off. And he obviously wasn't a very comfortable person to be around, I imagine. Wasn't very clubbable, as you might say.
But not only he inspired, and in this Nakuda, I had an argument with Rabbi Grylak. I'm sorry to say, who am I, compared to Rabbi Grylak? But Rabbi Grylak once told me that he was sad.
Yeah.
Because
who was sad?
Rabbi Grylak.
Yeah.
That he didn't see that Rabbi Grylak himself didn't feel that there were payers to Nathan Birnbaum's great efforts on Yiddishkeit in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe, that kufa. And I disagree with that because, number one, Rav Grylak himself told me that there were many East European Jews from Hassidic families who moved to Western Europe and to Belgium. He was talking about that, Belgium and France. And Nathan Birnbaum, together with another figure who I would like to write one day about, his name was Rabbi Yosef Bigon. And he was active for 3 years in Belgium. And they organized like Shurim and Machshava and Ramchal for these couples, these young couples of Jews who originated from Hasidic background in East Europe. And he gave them this new attachment to Yiddishkeit. So number one, he brought back families to Yiddishkeit, which is very important. That in itself is important. But besides that, what I found is that all the leaders of the Beis Yaakov movement, Rabbi Leo Deutschlander and Rabbi Yehuda Leib Orlin,
were Talmidim of
and Rabbi Tuvia Horowitz, were all associated with Beis Yaakov. Were all Talmidim, and they expressed that they were Talmidim of his. So imagine, like, the idea that to create this whole network of schools which saved thousands of Jewish souls and families.
We're inspired by him.
We're inspired by Nathan Birnbaum.
I remember him saying this. He called it Soltel Mishamna. of the creme de la creme, basically, of the young Goddess leadership, where he's considered himself his Talmidim. And as you say, that's an enormous impact. What he tried to do, let's just give it after the Aguda, he never left the Aguda, but he ceased to be actively involved. What he wanted to do was, he said, let us purify and revive and uplift from the Haredi world from within. Okay? By what? He created a movement called
the Olim.
The Olim.
The Olim.
I remember, I think it was the last episode that we talked about the Mauschlen, right? The Moshe mongrel dialect. So that was, if you were confused by the Mauschlen, then you have to also detranslate it by the Olim. The Olim is the Olim, right? Those who ascend us. And he set up this group, and that was his last stage, it was his last effort. And he wrote a pamphlet called the Divrei HaOlim, in which he criticized what he saw as the failures of Frum Jewry. And he founded groups called the Olim, and I think it was meant to be under the umbrella of Agudas Yisrael. I'm not sure how that worked. And he wanted to have a movement to inspire. Like, I think today you'd call it like Kirov Krovim.
Right, like a youth movement type of thing.
Yes. And he says the Olim were to focus, and by the way, we can't stop mentioning Rabbi Grylak Zatzal. I remember him sitting there in his office singing
the song.
Das Rachmim Tiferes. I don't know how it goes. I just remember him, Das Rachmim Tiferes. I have no idea if Rabbi Grylak had a good voice or not, but I just remember that. The Das Rachamim Tiferes,
probably
three
the
elements.
only person in the world who remembered that song.
Yes, I mean, it was a link to history, and this podcast is preserving it. Chevra out there, if you're listening, this is it. This is the legacy. Das Rachamim Tiferes. Broadly, they stood for service of Hashem, Rachmanus, and care for others, as well as outward dignity appropriate for Avdei Hashem, for Hashem's servants.
Sounds like a Slabotka type of...
Listen, it sounded like, look, this came from within. That's the point of him.
Right.
I think you quoted Chazal saying that the Gemara says that Avraham Avinu's two kidneys become, overflowing with Torah. It came from within, and because he was pure, he was on fire within. And he says that Olim were to be involved in agriculture because it's less corrupting than sort of bourgeois.
Yeah, he's a whole tirade against the modern society and the chimneys and the noise and the trains and how it distracts people.
I mean, this is so typical. Those who understand the literature at the time, this was a throwback to some of these absorbed elements along the way. They wanted to live in communities and abroad, and the Oila would be like the best of Hasidus and Musa and Derech Eretz, whatever. The point was, who were those, the cream of Poland's young, frum intellectuals, as you said, of Yehuda Berlin? And there was another one, those who know that Mayana Shel Torah of Alexander Zusha Friedman was also another one. And we also mentioned over here is the Ram Eli Kaplan, who was the young Goin from Slobodka we've mentioned in the last episode, who was the head of the Rabbiner seminar in Berlin. And it was published. We know that there's an organization called HDOS, which documented this online, in which there was the Musa journal, Hane'emon, which was published in Telz, which published this program as well. So we know it had it wasn't a mass movement, but wherever he went, he was able to attract, and just about the way he attracted young followers who were really passionate about him. So we quoted this man called Wolfsburg and his quite critical analysis of Nathan Birnbaum. He's not a fan, and yet he does say some very positive things. And he says about him that Nathan Birnbaum always remained an outsider. He said, because he had this focus on aesthetic Judaism, that's what he calls it, aesthetic Judaism, meaning this olim, you have to be dignified and etc. He said, but he was neither Warszawa nor Frankfurt. He wasn't rooted in Poland. He wasn't Taurim derech Eretz with the whole German Orthodox. He remained himself. And yet, his influence came from youth leaders, he says, who followed him like a prophet, right? And so that kind of sums that up. But I think we're going to wind down this episode over here with a few thoughts on his final years. So as we said, we struggled to pronounce his name. We struggled valiantly and managed to, at the end, to pronounce the name of the place where he was lived at the end of his life, Scheveningen in Holland. He went there in 1933, and he left Berlin, moved to Holland, and seemed to be safe. And there he published yet another newspaper. We didn't really go into it, but he published dozens of newspapers in his life. It was called Der Ruf, The Call. And he spoke about the growing threat to European Jewry, said go to Israel, which was full circle. But towards the end of his life, there was the incredible tributes poured in from everywhere about this person seen as, this Wolfsburg wrote, he said a prophetic, people followed him like a prophet. I think a final word about his legacy. His legacy as, what was his legacy? I've got some thoughts, but let's hear from you, Rabbi Efraim.
The power a Yid has within himself to reach the emes. We don't need much. Rav Oba talks about this. That's what tshuva means. Tshuva means returning to yourself. What the Torah is trying to do is trying to bring you back to what's already inside you. He's not coming to hoist something that's on top of you. And I think Dr. Nathan Birnbaum proves that idea.
I've got to totally agree with you. To me, it doesn't really matter whether the secular Zionist movement, remembers him or not. The Yiddishist movement has gone. I mean, this was a man clearly of great force and leadership and a visionary man. But for me, the fact, this is what Rabbi Grylak was saying, he was Avram Avinu. He broke all of the psalim, all the idols of his time, all the isms. He basically collapsed a couple of centuries worth of isms into his own life, threw them all out, one after the other. When someone has blazed a trail in that way, then others can go in their path, whether they know it or not. And I think that his story was epic by any measure. But what he did was he faced the kind of entire majestic edifice of Western and Jewish secularism in its prime. In its prime. He declared it, he said, that's a house of cards. As a major intellectual force in the secular Jewish world, that's what the effect of the shockwaves. He says, beginning as a teenager, his life, that was, if I had to look one way, this is what, as you see, I've been on my hobby horse right from the beginning of the last episode, essentially. It's only through secular eyes that don't care or don't know about the Torah that you could say he's erratic. Because there's something so sustained about what he's doing. He's searching for the fissile core of the Jewish people. When he found it, he was content. And that, for me, for that reason alone, Nathan Birnbaum deserves not this kind of little place on, a side street next to Zichron Moshe. He deserves to come in from the dusty side streets of Jewish memory.
Beautiful.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.